السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So, two parts tonight. So the first part, the boring part, which is the sciences of the Quran. Actually, subhanAllah, we're going to talk about the qira'at tonight. So I'm glad that Imam Rifai gave this introduction. Around the 3rd century of Islam, around the 200s, the ulama of the Quran, they decided, or they started to gather the different chains of transmission for the different recitations of the Quran, because there are different ways of reciting the Quran. So not only does the Quran have to be printed according to the Uthmanic script, and maybe tomorrow or my next round of 3 we'll talk about the Uthmanic script, it has to be printed according to a recitation. So if you pick up the Mus'haf, it will say, معلش أنس. اللهم لا تخيب ذمي. So it says Al-Quran Al-Kareem bil-Rasm Al-Uthmani, with the Uthmanic script. And then at the end it will say, according to which recitation, most likely this one it will say Hafs and Asim. So in the back of the Mus'haf, it says that this Quran was printed according to the Uthmanic script and according to the recitation of Hafs and Asim. So the Qurans that come from Medina al-Munawwara, from the King Fahd Quranic complex, Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, most of them, that's the Mus'haf that we grew up with, right? We grew up with the green Mus'haf, or it's blue, the large, the small. So it has the script, the Uthmanic script, and the recitation. What is the recitation? The recitation is how we pronounce the verses, how we read the verses. So Anas was reading in Warsh, so you'll hear al-mu'minun, not al-mu'minun, but there's still a hamza on the waw. But in one recitation you say al-mu'min, you pronounce the hamza. In another recitation you don't. When Anas began Surah Al-Isra, first he made a slight mistake. قرأت بحفص سبحان الذي أسرى, but it's أسرى. So in Warsh it's أسرى. In Hafs it's أسرى. You're like, okay, what's the big deal? But I know, and I know. I'm just showing you, I'm just letting you know that I know. So you don't think that I don't know. I know. I let you slide. Alhamdulillah. Now Anas, mashallah, Allah Ta'ala preserve him. So you might think, oh, what's the big deal? What is a big deal? Because how many recitations do we have? We have 10 recitations. There are 7 main recitations, and there are 3 minor, less popular ones after the 7, for a total of 10 recitations. Each single recitation has its own scheme of how you pronounce every single letter, every single word in the Quran from the beginning to the end. So to recite properly in the Quran, you have to recite consistently according to one of those recitations. Each one of those recitations traces its chain back to the Prophet ﷺ in an unbroken chain of transmission. Which means that not only is the Quran preserved in how it is written, in the script of the Quran, how the words are spelled, but the Quran is also preserved in how we recite it, how it sounds. Now that's quite amazing. So it's not that this is the modern way of reciting the Quran. This is the way that the Sahaba recited the Quran. This is how it sounded when Gabriel came to deliver the Quran to the Prophet ﷺ. If you look at any piece of literature, like I was just looking the other day at Beowulf, because sometimes you look at Beowulf in the middle of Ramadan. Beowulf is written in Old English. The copy I have has Old English on the left, and it's called a translation into English on the right. I can't read the Old English. I can't even read the words. I wouldn't even know how to pronounce them. Maybe I could pronounce them, but it would sound wrong. I don't know how it sounds in its original. So if you want to read the poem Beowulf, you're only going to read it in English, unless you studied Anglo-Saxon language or something like that. And I've made this point before, old poetry, the poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey and things like that, old literature, we do not necessarily know how they sounded. We think, we try, we don't know how Shakespeare sounded. People that read Shakespeare, they tend to imitate a modern British voice, which is incorrect. That's not how the English of Shakespeare's time sounded. But we don't know exactly. But with the Quran, it's different. This is exactly how it sounds. This is exactly how it's recited. Every single letter, the stress of every, is it Musa or is it Muse? Is it Wadduha or Ad-Duhi? Is it Maliki Yawmiddin or Maliki Yawmiddin? Those are different recitations. But every recitation is documented. Now, the thing about the recitations is that there are recitations that are not at the level of the 10. And those recitations are considered non-canonical recitations. Al-Qira'at al-Shadha. Al-Qira'at al-Shadha, we use them as tafsir. When the Prophet ﷺ received revelation, he ordered the companions to write down, not only did they memorize it, but they actually wrote down the Quran at the time of the revelation. On parchment papers, bones, things like that. Some of the companions would write a commentary on the verse, like وَحَافِظُوا عَلَى الصَّلَاةِ الْوُسْطَى وَهِيَ الْعَصْرِ. So keep the middle prayer, and then the Sahaba would add the commentary, and then the middle prayer is Asr prayer. Asr prayer is not part of the Quran. So when the Quran was compiled, sometimes this gets added as a recitation. But because it's not at the level of tawatur, it's not at the level of diffuse congruence as the 10 recitations are narrated. We talked about that in the beginning of the month. I hope you remember that word, tawatur. Those qira'at, it is not permissible to recite the Quran in those qira'at, but we use those qira'at as a tafsir. We use them as an aid, as a guidance. So the science of the qira'at is a huge discipline. It's its own discipline. Not only is it a discipline of the Quran, but it is its own discipline altogether. It takes a long time. You have to memorize the whole Quran first, and then you have to go back and read like Al-Jazari's poem on the qira'at and memorize it, and then you have to go through the qira'at, every verse, to recite it in the 10 modes or the 10 ways with a trained person to be able to complete your training in that discipline. So this shows you the unbelievable amount of precision that we have in documenting the Quran, and how the order of the verses, the spelling of the verses and the words, and how it sounds, how it is recited. If you go anywhere in the Muslim world, it doesn't matter Arab or non-Arab, if they have trained to read the Quran properly, they will all sound the same. They will all be using the same words of the recitation. Okay, that's the dry part. A story about perseverance and injustice. Almost all of the people that I studied with, almost all of them, they all studied with, they have one teacher in common. And this one teacher was Sayyid Abdullah ibn Siddiq Elgawhary, rahimahullah, a very famous Moroccan scholar. Now you know why. I don't need an excuse to love Moroccans and Morocco, but this is one of the reasons why I love the Moroccans and Morocco. Sayyid Abdullah ibn Siddiq Elgawhary, he was born in 1910 in Tangiers, and he died in Tangiers in 1993. Sayyid Abdullah comes from a very illustrious family. The Ghumari family is a family that traces its lineage back to the Prophet ﷺ. They have a very high lineage in Morocco. They are a well-known family of scholarship. They are also a well-known family of tasawwuf. They carry one of the lineages of the Shadhili tariqah. Sayyid Abdullah's father, Sayyid Muhammad al-Siddiq al-Ghumari, he is the one that established the Zawiyah of the Siddiqiyah in the old city of Tangiers. Abdullah had an older brother, Sayyid Ahmad. Sayyid Ahmad radiallahu anhu was even more of a big deal, but I'm going to give you the story. He died young. He died when he was 60. Maybe another time we'll talk about that. But I want to tell you about Sayyid Abdullah and an unbelievable tribulation he went through, just to show you how significant he is. I can trace my chain of transmission back to every madhab, to the Maliki, the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali madhab through Sayyid Abdullah. And I can trace my train of transmission back to the 6 books of hadith, Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Nisa'i, Dawood, Ibn Majah, all of them from Sayyid Abdullah. And I can trace my lineage back to Abu Hassan al-Shadhili, the spiritual lineage, also from Sayyid Abdullah, all from this one person. Sayyid Abdullah, his father sent him to Egypt to study. He went to Al-Qarawin first. as was normal of the people of Morocco at the time when he was a young man. And then his father sent him to Egypt to go study with the ulama of Egypt, which was not that common. So Sayyid Abdullah, he came to Egypt and he studied, him and his older brother, Sayyid Ahmed. And he was very, very bright from the beginning. It was very obvious that this young person is extremely bright, extremely well-rounded, a master of all of these disciplines. He took his examination. At that time, it was called the Alamiyya examination. He took it twice, once for foreigners. And when they told him, you're not going to be accepted in Egypt as a real alim unless you take the Egyptian version, he took the Egyptian version as well, and he passed both. And he was living his life as a scholar. He was writing articles. He was averaging an article a month for, an academic size article. For those of you that write academic articles, that's a huge feat in and of itself. And everything was fine until the revolution in Egypt in 1952. Now, I don't want to get into politics, but there was this weird, Arab nationalism in Egypt. And Gamal Abdel Nasser, to make a long story short, he was not friends with Arab monarchies because of the Ba'ath Party or whatever the thing was. That's not what's important. What's important is there was tensions between Egypt and Morocco. And to make a long story short, Abdullah bin Sadiq al-Ghumari, through this unbelievable story of intrigue, which I happen to know the details of, but I don't feel it's appropriate to share with you because it will not add anything to the discussion, he was arrested on the charge of spying for a foreign country. So this is a young, scholar, just living his life as a scholar, giving lectures, writing books, writing articles, and then all of a sudden he gets himself arrested. He goes to court, there's no representation, and within seconds, the judge gives the pronouncement that he is to be hung and executed. At that moment, as Sayyid Abdullah, something happened to him. And he looked at the judge. He said, "Ana la amut, anta tamut. Ana la amut, anta tamut. Ana la amut, anta tamut." He said, "I'm not going to die. You're going to die." He kept repeating it, repeating it, repeating it. People around him, they calmed down. They thought he went crazy. They thought he buckled. But something else happened. Sayyid Abdullah was taken to jail. A month later, this judge, under mysterious circumstances, committed suicide, jumped from the balcony of his apartment building and died. When the file went to Gamal Abdel Nasser to confirm the execution, Gamal Abdel Nasser stayed his execution, took a pencil and wrote on the cover of his file that he is to remain in jail ma dumtu hayya, as long as I am alive, not as long as he is alive, which is very odd. Maybe he didn't know how to write, or maybe he made a mistake, but he wrote, as long as I am alive. I'm serious, you can't make this stuff up. So Sayyid Abdullah radiallahu anhu, he ends up going to jail for 10 years. And when Gamal Abdel Nasser died and Anwar Sadat became president, it is said like one of the first things that he signed was the release of the Sayyid Abdullah. Sayyid Abdullah, moments ago, the day before yesterday, he was living the life of a scholar. And then yesterday he was arrested. And then today he was set to be executed. And now he's in jail. And now he's in jail for as long as this guy's going to be alive. Allahu alam how long it's going to last. So he really, it was a lot was going on inside him. But he said, I use this time to my advantage. In the 10 years that Sayyid Abdullah was in jail, he wrote 23 books. Most of them from memory, and all of them were published during his lifetime. And because the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, they end up coming to jail after him, so compared to the Ikhwan, he was like a saintly person. He was not considered an enemy of the state. The Ikhwan, they were not treated very kindly in the jail. And actually Abdullah writes to his brother and writes to Ahmed al-Mursi, who I mentioned yesterday. They were friends. He said, if I told you what's happening in the jail, you wouldn't believe what's happening. But he convinced the people of the jail to give him ink and to give him paper. No one cared about the library, so they made him the librarian of the library. And because no one cared to read, he ordered all of the books that he could ever think of, that he ever wanted. So he amassed in the library, in the jail, a massive library. He has an endless supply of ink and pens and paper, and he's writing, and he authored those 23 books. And most of the books, I'll read them, and at the end of the book he says, I would want to say more, but because of the difficulties that I'm in, I'm not able to. Or I want to say more, but I don't have all of the sources available. This is what I could remember from memory. But that book, from memory, I mean, that's like an average of a book every 6 months until he was released from jail. When he emerged from jail, 10 years later, the people that knew him before, they said, he's not the same person. He had committed in jail, he had committed to memory the text and the chains of transmission of over 50,000 hadith. In addition, that's why we refer to him as Al-Hafidh, as Sayyid Abdullah bin Siddiq. He was a Hafidh of hadith. In addition to memorizing the Quran, all of the standard stuff, he had committed to memory the text and the chains of transmission of over 50,000 hadith. And the people that saw him afterwards said he was a different man than the person who went in. He went on to live a fruitful life. He died, as I said, in 1993. He moved back to Morocco probably for obvious reasons, but he continued his connection with Egypt, and he would come to Egypt twice a year. And if you want to see a most hilarious picture of the Sheikh, look up Abdullah Elgawhary and Muhammad Ali Clay. So he actually came to the United States twice. I think he had eye surgery. And there's a picture of Muhammad Ali hugging, Muhammad Ali is like this giant, and he's like hugging the Sheikh. The Sheikh looks like this little Moroccan man with his Moroccan jalaba. It's a very cute picture of the Sheikh. And he lived the rest of his life, dedicated to his craft of scholarship. I mentioned this story to you for two reasons. Number one, I just recently wrote a biography of the Sheikh. I sent it to the publisher, so hopefully it will be published someday. I'll share it with you. So he was on my mind. But two, I asked myself when I got into that portion about jail, I asked myself, what would I do if I was in jail for 10 years? What would I do if I had this great calamity? What he did is that's what his nature was. His nature was to be a scholar. Yes, it was difficult. It was hard. He lost touch with his family. His brother Ahmed died a year while he was in jail. He had a sudden heart attack and he passed away at a very young age. But what was inside him, that's what came out. And that's the lesson I got from that story. What's inside me? If you leave me alone somewhere in a room for a month, what am I going to end up doing? What are you going to end up doing? The answer to the question, that answer for each one of you, that's who you are. If you were incarcerated in that way, what you would do, how you would react, that's really who you are. In Arabic, we have a statement, عند الشدائد تعرف الأصدقاء. When things are difficult, you know who your real friends are. But when things are difficult, you really know who you are. Are you angry? Do you give up hope? Or do you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Do you default on your beliefs? Do you default on your principles, on your values? He defaulted on his training. He wrote 23 books. He kept going. He kept offering services to the ummah. Even though he was unjustly, not a shred of evidence for, this weird, made up case against him. But he didn't hold any grudges in his heart. He kept going. And he says in his autobiography, they were difficult days, but they were also days in which Allah gave us gifts and benefits. So it's a story about perseverance, about injustice. With every act of difficulty that we go through, inshallah, on the flip side, there is going to be a side of ease, inshallah, bi'idhnillah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.